Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight, we're heading down under to Melbourne, Australia. A case that's been ice cold for nearly 50 years just started to move again. Fresh DNA, an arrest in Rome, and the whole country waiting to see if justice can still speak after almost half a century. We'll break down everything from the quiet house on Easey Street to the courtroom in 2025 and follow this story as it unfolds, update by update. So before we dive in, do the usual, hit like, tap subscribe, and drop a comment if you want me to cover the verdict once it drops. Alright, lights low, volume up. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Easey Street Murders, Part 1, where the ghosts of two innocent women just found their voice again. Let's begin. Melbourne, January 1977. The heat had opinions. It argued with the tin roofs, bullied the curtains, and made even good people swear at appliances. Collingwood wasn't cute yet. It was loud, broke, and practical, like a cousin who turns up with a toolkit and a hangover. Easey Street was a narrow exhale of brick and habits, where front yards were more suggestion than land, and everyone knew exactly how long your washing had been on the line. Number 147 didn't look special. The lacework was doing its best. The paint believed in second chances, and the little veranda had the posture of someone who'd given up on posture. Inside lived two women who were busy being ordinary in the most heroic way possible, earning money, paying rent, and pretending adulthood came with instructions. Suzanne Armstrong, 28, teacher and single mum, could triage a crisis with a tea towel and a raised eyebrow. She had that clever calm you get from doing too much with too little for just long enough that it becomes a personality trait. She liked lists, disliked drama, and had trained herself to smile at problems until they got embarrassed and left. Her son, 16 months of stubborn weather, occupied a cot, a high chair, and the entire moral center of the house. And yes, the father existed, just not in any useful time zone. A boyfriend who'd managed to evolve from person to rumor without passing through reliable. He sent promises the way other people sent postcards, cheerful, late, and not intended to be answered. Suzanne edited that subplot out of her daily script. Babies need milk. Landlords like money. The school wants you on time. None of that waits while you chase a ghost. Her flatmate was Susan Bartlett, 27, teacher as well, the kind of woman who could turn a staff room into a support group in under 3 minutes. Where Suzanne did logistics, Susan did mood. She collected small joys. A nice pen, a student who finally got long division, a second-hand dress that looked first-hand at dusk. If Suzanne was the house's spine, Susan was the laugh in the kitchen that made the walls less serious. They'd met years back, liked each other immediately, and made the sensible financial decision to survive together. The house bore the marks of two young teachers battling entropy with limited resources. A bookcase that had ideas above its station. A fan that clicked like an old man telling stories. A table polka-dotted with coffee rings and optimism. The wallpaper was previous tenant chic. The kettle was heroic. In the bedroom, clothes negotiated truces with the heat. In the hallway, a pram lounged like a visiting monarch. On the fridge, a calendar believed in paydays the way poets believe in metaphors. Passionately, against the odds, evenings had a choreography. The baby's bath, the baby's protest, the baby's surrender. Piles of exercise books doing the world's slowest descent into being marked. 2 mugs of cheap instant pretending to be coffee. steam rising like hope. Someone put on a record because silence in that heat felt accusatory. Fleetwood Mac wandered in from the future and took off its shoes. Conversation drifted. What the headmaster said. What the rent might do next month. Who was seeing whom and why that was never the problem people thought it was. Ordinary things. The scaffolding of a life that trusted tomorrow to behave. If you walked past number 147 around 10, you would have seen the soft rectangle of light on the curtains and heard nothing remarkable. A laugh, a chair leg, a quiet house being good at being a house. The baby, finally defeated by bedtime, slept with the conviction of a small lawyer who has won his case. Somewhere out back, the laneway smelled like brick dust and someone else's dinner. Somewhere out front, night wrapped the street the way a cheap suit wraps a promise. Suzanne moved the way mothers do when the baby's asleep, and every sound becomes a negotiation. Susan did that teacher thing where you recount a day like a detective. The clue at 10:15, the twist at recess, the confession near the bell. They were exactly where they were meant to be. Two normal women in a normal house on a normal Monday, which is the precise moment life likes to practice its worst magic trick. Misdirection. Look over here, it says, while it changes everything over there. Nothing in the air suggested a plot. There was no chill, no omen, no raven tapping at the window asking for an autograph. The fan kept lying about being useful. The record clicked into the next track. One of them made a note to buy milk tomorrow. The other rolled her eyes at the fact that tomorrow kept expecting to be fed. They didn't speak like people in a story. That's the whole point. People in stories have foreshadowing. People in houses have laundry. You could diagram their lives on squared paper. Thin income, thick responsibility, multiple arrows to tired. And yet, they built something that felt solid in a suburb famous for wobble. A routine, a rhythm, 2 salaries, 1 roof, a toddler who thought spoons were a belief system. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't need to be. It was gentle, and gentleness is rare enough to be considered treasure. Out on Easey Street, the heat finally loosened its jaw. A dog signed off for the night. Somewhere a tram sighed like a tired uncle. The city turned the page with its usual indifference. Inside number 147, the lights would soon go out. The baby would breathe his small, determined breaths. 2 teachers would sleep the sleep of people who have to be functional in 7 hours. The future, notorious for not phoning ahead, would sit down quietly at the end of the bed and wait. And for 3 days, in that small house, a baby waited for voices that never came back. 3 days later, Colin would start to smell wrong. Not the usual cocktail of beer, sweat, and somebody's burnt dinner. Something heavier, sweeter, like meat left out in the heat. Nobody rushed to investigate. It was January, after all. Everyone blamed the weather or the drains. Easey Street didn't do drama. On Thursday, January 13th, a friend of Suzanne's knocked on the door of number 147. She expected a tired mother, maybe an overdue chat about lesson plans. What she got was silence. Not the calm kind, the suspicious kind. The kind that hums in your ears until you start imagining footsteps that aren't there. She called out. Nothing. The baby didn't answer, though he usually did. The door wasn't locked tight. It opened just enough to let out the smell and let the world in. What she found inside would become one of Melbourne's darkest legends. Suzanne Armstrong lay in her bedroom. 27 stab wounds. The sheets twisted in ways sheets shouldn't be. Susan Bartlett was in the hallway, closer to the door, as if she'd tried to leave, or tried to stop someone else from leaving. 55 stab wounds. The kind of overkill that tells you this wasn't a quick burglary gone wrong. It was rage wearing shoes. The 16-month-old boy was still alive, barely. Dehydrated, exhausted, but alive. The house was otherwise neat. No broken locks, no ransacked drawers. The back lane gate was open. The bathroom showed signs someone had washed up. Towels damp, water cloudy. Whoever did this took a moment to tidy themselves before walking out into the hot, indifferent daylight. When the police finally arrived, they entered the way cops always do in the 70s, unbothered by gloves or contamination theory. They tramped through the rooms, catalogued horror with notebooks, smoked cigarettes in the yard while pretending to think. Evidence was handled, mishandled, borrowed, lost. It was a different era of forensics, the kind that mostly relied on guesswork and stern expressions. Reporters showed up before the coroner. They stood outside number 147, writing the words, "brutal slaying" and "Easey Street massacre" before anyone had even zipped a body bag. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, already rehearsing their sound bites. "They were such nice girls," someone said, and that would be printed in the next day's paper, as if niceness ever saved anyone. Inside the house, the detectives argued about entry points. No forced door, a footprint on the window ledge maybe. But if it was a break-in, why no robbery? Jewellery untouched. Money still in wallets. And who kills two women and leaves a crying child alone? That detail sat in every cop's stomach like a stone. They took the baby to hospital where he was cleaned, fed, and promptly became the only survivor of a story that would outlive everyone in that room. His name was never made public. He was given in the press the kind of pity that sells papers. Within 24 hours, Collingwood had turned into a stage set. Police lines, news vans, crowds, every theory you can imagine got its debut. Jealous ex, stranger on a spree, drug deal, lover's quarrel, random psycho. None of them stuck. The only solid fact was that two women were dead in a house that didn't look robbed, and whoever did it had enough composure to clean up. When the bodies were finally removed, the street exhaled. Windows opened again. Kids were told not to play too close to number 147. Someone scrubbed the sidewalk, because that's what people do when they can't fix anything. They clean. That night, the reporters filed their pieces and went home. The police filled out their reports and told themselves it was just another case. But everyone who'd stepped into that house knew different. This one was going to follow them. The official file would soon explode into lists of suspects and rumors and dead ends. But before that chaos, there was this. A neat little terrace, a horror that made no sense, and a city that suddenly realized evil didn't always knock before coming in. Next came panic, because Melbourne was about to learn that unsolved murders have a way of breeding fear faster than flies. The news hit Melbourne like a kick to the ribs. 2 young women murdered in their own home. No break-in, no theft, no sense. By Friday morning, every paper in town had a headline that screamed, "Easey Street Horror." The journalists didn't know much, but what they lacked in facts they made up for in adjectives. Savage, brutal, unthinkable. You could almost hear the editors salivating. Collingwood, usually too busy minding its own chaos, froze. Women stopped walking home alone. Hardware stores sold out-of-door bolts by lunchtime. The local butcher started delivering again because no one wanted to walk those few blocks after dark. The phone lines lit up with tips, theories, and the kind of gossip that feeds on fear. Police patrolled the neighborhood in pairs, mostly for show. Reporters chased every rumor like it owed them money. A strange man seen near Easey Street. A black car that came and went at odd hours. A neighbour's dog that wouldn't stop barking. None of it went anywhere. Still, it made great copy. For the first week, detectives worked as if they could outpace panic. They interviewed anyone who'd ever waved at the victims. Colleagues, ex-boyfriends, relatives, the milkman. The father of Suzanne's baby was questioned naturally. The ghost finally summoned back to reality. He was found, grilled, cleared, and sent away again to resume being a convenient absence. The police commissioner promised the public progress, which meant there was none. Politicians got involved, because nothing says leadership like hovering near a tragedy. Even the premier managed a statement about protecting our women, which sounded better than admitting they had no idea who was butchering them. By the second week, Melbourne wasn't just afraid, it was paranoid. Every creak in an old terrace sounded like an intruder. Every unfamiliar face became a suspect. Taxi drivers swapped theories over the radio. Pubs were full of amateur detectives who all knew exactly what the cops were doing wrong. The tabloids fueled it with the usual melodrama, is a serial killer on the loose? Conveniently forgetting that the police had found precisely one crime scene. But logic never sells as well as fear. One paper printed a photo of the victim's house. So often it became a kind of civic mascot for dread. Meanwhile, the investigation stumbled over its own feet. Evidence went missing, samples spoiled in the summer heat. The crime lab could match blood types, but not much else. DNA was still science fiction. What they had were fingerprints that didn't match anyone, and a bloody shoe print that matched everyone. Detectives started calling it the teacher murders, which sounded clinical enough to file away. Behind closed doors, though, the force was split. Some insisted it had to be someone they knew. A man with a grudge, a lover turned violent. Others argued for a stranger, a prowler, the kind of drifter that haunted urban myths. The city didn't care who was right, it just wanted someone to blame. By February, women were carrying whistles, neighbours formed watch patrols, and bars in Collingwood had a new rule. No one walks home alone. And still, the killer was nowhere. No sightings, no confession. No one boasting drunk in a pub about that job in Collingwood. Whoever had done it had vanished back into the city's noise like a ghost that paid rent. By March, the headlines had grown tired. The story moved off the front page, replaced by cricket scores and election scandals. People exhaled cautiously, pretending the fear had passed. But Collingwood didn't forget. Because every time someone walked past 147 Easey Street, they still glanced at the window, just to check it was dark. The news hit Melbourne like a kick to the ribs. 2 young women murdered in their own home, no break-in, no theft, no sense. By Friday morning, every paper in town had a headline that screamed, "The Street Horror." The journalists didn't know much, but what they lacked in facts they made up for in adjectives. Savage, brutal, unthinkable. You could almost hear the editors salivating. Collingwood, usually too busy minding its own chaos, froze. Women stopped walking home alone. Hardware stores sold out of door bolts by lunchtime. The local butchers started delivering again because no one wanted to walk those few blocks after dark. The phone lines lit up with tips, theories, and the kind of gossip that feeds on fear. Police patrolled the neighborhood in pairs, mostly for show. Reporters chased every rumor like it owed them money. A strange man seen near Easey Street, a black car that came and went at odd hours, a neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking. None of it went anywhere. Still, it made great copy. For the first week, detectives worked as if they could outpace panic. They interviewed anyone who'd ever waved at the victims. Colleagues, ex-boyfriends, relatives, the milkman. The father of Suzanne's baby was questioned. Naturally, the ghost finally summoned back to reality. He was found, grilled, cleared, and sent away again to resume being a convenient absence. The police commissioner promised the public progress, which meant there was none. Politicians got involved, because nothing says leadership like hovering near a tragedy. Even the Premier managed a statement about protecting our women, which sounded better than admitting they had no idea who was butchering them. By the second week, Melbourne wasn't just afraid, it was paranoid. Every creak in an old terrace sounded like an intruder. Every unfamiliar face became a suspect. Taxi drivers swapped theories over the radio. Pubs were full of amateur detectives who all knew exactly what the cops were doing wrong. The tabloids fueled it with the usual melodrama. Is a serial killer on the loose? Conveniently forgetting that the police had found precisely one crime scene. But logic never sells as well as fear. One paper printed a photo of the victim's house. So often it became a kind of civic mascot for dread. Meanwhile, the investigation stumbled over its own feet. Evidence went missing, samples spoiled in the summer heat. The crime lab could match blood types, but not much else. DNA was still science fiction. What they had were fingerprints that didn't match anyone, and a bloody shoe print that matched everyone. Detectives started calling it the teacher murders, which sounded clinical enough to file away. Behind closed doors, though, the force was split. Some insisted it had to be someone they knew, a man with a grudge, a lover turned violent. Others argued for a stranger, a prowler, the kind of drifter that haunted urban myths. The city didn't care who was right, it just wanted someone to blame. By February, women were carrying whistles, neighbours formed watch patrols, and bars in Collingwood had a new rule: no one walks home alone. And still, the killer was nowhere. No sightings, no confession. No one boasting drunk in a pub about that job in Collingwood. Whoever had done it had vanished back into the city's noise like a ghost that paid rent. By March, the headlines had grown tired. The story moved off the front page, replaced by cricket scores and election scandals. People exhaled, cautiously, pretending the fear had passed. But Collingwood didn't forget. Because every time someone walked past 147 Easey Street, they still glanced at the window, just to check it was dark. Next came the quiet years, when the case sank beneath dust and denial, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig it up again. Every old case file smells the same: dust, cigarette smoke, and regret. By 2011, the Easey Street file had been gathering all three for more than 3 decades. Most detectives treated it like a haunted object. Don't touch it, don't mention it, and definitely don't try to solve it. But then there was Ron Iddles, the man who made a career out of ignoring good advice. Ron wasn't a desk cop. He was one of those old-school homicide detectives who solved murders through equal parts persistence, guilt, and caffeine. A quiet bulldog, in a cheap suit, blunt as a brick, with the patience of someone who's forgotten what retirement means. He didn't believe in luck, he believed in work, and he hated unsolved murders. So when he saw the box marked Easey Street, 1977 gathering dust in the archives, he didn't see failure. He saw something personal. 2 young women, both teachers, the kind of case that should have been easy, should have had closure, but didn't. It ate at him. "If we can't solve this," he said to a colleague, then what the hell are we here for? The file was a time capsule of 1970s policing, handwritten notes in fading biro, witness statements stapled crookedly, photos curling at the edges. The evidence logs were patchy at best. Some entries simply said, removed. No explanation, no signature, no return. Half the people listed as witnesses were either dead or living somewhere that didn't want to be found. But Iddles had seen worse. He began at page 1 and worked forward, treating every note like it still mattered. The original detectives had suspected everything from a jealous lover to a random intruder. None of it made sense. No robbery, no forced entry, and whoever had done it had been. Calm enough to wash up afterwards. That, to Ron, was the giveaway. He'd seen enough frenzied killings to know that panic leaves mess. This one didn't. He asked for the old evidence boxes. The clerk looked at him like he'd just asked for the Ark of the Covenant. When they finally arrived, they looked like relics from another civilization. Cracked tape, peeling labels, the smell of decades-old formaldehyde. Inside were the remnants of lives. Clothes, sheets, fingernail scrapings, and miraculously, a few preserved swabs. Half this'll be useless, someone told him. Half's more than nothing, he said. Ron pushed to have everything retested using modern forensics. It took months of paperwork, budget wrangling, and arguments with people who thought closure was just a word you said to families. Eventually, samples went off to the lab. Not expecting miracles, just hoping the technology had caught up to the failure. And then it happened. A partial DNA profile. Male, unidentified. Weak, but clear enough to confirm one thing. A man had been inside the house that night. Not one of the victims, not an investigator. Someone else. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Ron didn't celebrate. He'd been around long enough to know that small victories only mattered if you could drag them across the finish line. It's not proof, he told the team, but it's a direction. And directions are how you get home. He started mapping names. Anyone connected to the victims. Students, ex-boyfriends, neighbors, family friends, tenants from nearby houses. Then he did something most detectives don't. He started talking to people again. Face to face, no press, no microphones, just that quiet pressure of a man who already knows the answer and is waiting for you to say it out loud. One former neighbor remembered a teenager who used to hang around. 17 maybe, lived nearby. Bit odd, she said. Quiet. Watch people. Others mentioned him too. Always vaguely. Always that kid. Ron wrote down the name and didn't tell anyone. Not yet. He wanted the science to speak first. He had the lab compare the DNA to old criminal databases, just in case that teenager had ever left a trace behind. No match. But Ron wasn't discouraged. He was patient. And patience in homicide is the closest thing to superpower. He spent nights reading the file at his kitchen table, eating toast over decades-old photographs. In interviews years later, he said it wasn't about obsession. It's about respect, he said. You don't leave people in the dark if you can help it. He also knew time was running out, not for the case, but for justice. Witnesses die, memories rot, evidence degrades, but DNA doesn't forget. And if that tiny genetic whisper could survive 34 years in a half-crushed plastic bag, then maybe there was still a chance. Colleagues rolled their eyes. You think you're going to find him after all this time? Ron just smirked. Maybe he's hoping I don't. By the time the reopened investigation made its way up the chain of command, something had shifted. The mood in the department changed from polite disbelief to cautious curiosity. Someone at the top finally said, "All right, Iddles, Let's see what your ghost has to say. And for the first time in decades, 147 Easey Street was no longer a tomb. It was a case again. Because somewhere in those old evidence boxes, in a single cell, a forgotten hair, or a drop of dried blood, the past was still talking. And Ron Iddles was the only one who was listening. DNA doesn't care about deadlines. It doesn't care about politics or police budgets, or whether an entire city has already stopped paying attention. It just sits quietly in its little molecular corner, waiting for someone patient enough or stubborn enough to listen. By 2012, Victoria Police had entered the forensic age properly. What once required an entire lab and divine intervention could now be done with half a sample and the right machine. The case that had once mocked investigators with its emptiness suddenly had something to say. The degraded trace that Ron Iddles had coaxed out of storage wasn't much. A partial male profile, barely there. It was so faint that one technician called it a whisper. But whispers can get loud when the technology finally catches up. A reanalysis using updated sequencing techniques revealed enough to rule out contamination. This wasn't an old detective's sweat or a random visitor. It was something from that night. Ron watched as the report came through. Male DNA detected on one victim's nightclothes. Not belonging to either woman, not police, not the child. That was the first heartbeat the case had shown in decades. The next step was database comparison. The forensic team uploaded the profile into the national system. A digital lottery that sometimes spits out miracles. Weeks passed, nothing. Then months, still nothing. Ron wasn't surprised. Whoever had done this hadn't been caught for anything else. That kind of luck requires practice. So he went old school again. Not with magnifying glasses and cigarettes this time, but with strategy. If the DNA belonged to a male who lived locally, he reasoned, someone must remember him. 17 years old back then, living somewhere near Easey Street. Someone who knew the women. Someone who could enter the house without breaking anything. The interviews began again. Former neighbours, retired teachers, ex-boyfriends, local shop owners. Most gave polite versions of no idea. But one name started popping up. A teenager from the area. Son of a local family. Quiet, odd, always hanging around. His name was Perikilis Kouroumblis. Peri to those who could pronounce neither. In 1977, he'd been 17, just old enough to be invisible to suspicion, and young enough to be underestimated. He lived less than a kilometre from the victims. One witness recalled he'd helped carry groceries once. Another thought she'd seen him near the house that week. Nothing definite, but it was enough to make Ron circle the name in red pen. Then came a break that wasn't a break yet. A fragment of DNA from an old, unrelated assault case, stored in the system under unknown male. When cross-checked manually, because Ron didn't trust software to think like humans. The partial sequences overlapped. Not a full match, but close enough to raise every eyebrow in the room. Could be him, said the analyst. Could be, said Ron, which is detective speak, for it is, until you prove otherwise. More tests followed. Family DNA searches, the kind that trace bloodlines instead of names. And suddenly, quietly, the algorithm pinged. A familial link to a relative of Kouroumblis, who had been tested years later for a minor crime. It wasn't proof, not yet, but the pattern was there. Iddles called it a ghost recognizing itself. They kept it quiet. No leaks, no press. This wasn't ready for the spotlight. The man they were looking at had vanished decades ago, leaving almost nothing. No criminal record, no phone number, barely a digital footprint. It turned out he'd left Australia in the early 2000s, moved to Italy, and reinvented himself as a retiree with a view. The investigators stared at the screen. After 40 years, the killer might be living under the Tuscan sun. The lab confirmed it again. The DNA from Easey Street was male, and the probability that it belonged to someone other than Kouroumblis was less than 1 in 100 billion. Ron didn't smile. He just nodded. Get me his address. In the sterile hum of a Victorian lab, under fluorescent lights that never sleep, the past had finally spoken, not in words, but in cells. And it had whispered a name. In 1977, Perikilis Peri Kouroumblis was the kind of boy who never made headlines. The one you forget in a classroom photo. Somewhere near the back. Squinting at the camera like it owes him money. He was 17. Australian-born to Greek immigrant parents who ran a small corner deli on the edge of Collingwood. His father worked himself to the bone. His mother worshipped order and reputation, and Perry was the quiet one. Too quiet. Neighbours remembered him vaguely. He wasn't the type who shouted, drank, or played footy. He lingered, stood on corners, hands in pockets, eyes somewhere else. A bit odd, one woman said later. He looked like he was listening to things you couldn't hear. Others said he'd wandered the streets at night, sometimes just watching houses. The sort of behaviour that in the 70s was brushed off as teenage boredom, not the opening act of something far worse. He lived barely a kilometre from 147 Easey Street, went to a nearby school, passed that street daily. Nobody connected him to anything. He was just another shadow in a suburb full of them. When police canvassed the area after the murders, his name surfaced once in passing. A teenage neighbour who might have known one of the women from the education centre. He was questioned briefly, his answers unremarkable, his manner polite. The notes next to his name read simply, 17, local boy, no record. And that was it. The boy vanished from the investigation like steam from summer asphalt. He grew older, quietly, drifted through jobs, carpentry, warehouse shifts, handyman gigs. Nothing stuck. He wasn't violent, not openly. He just had that emptiness some people carry, like luggage. Friends, if you could call them that, described him as detached. He didn't laugh much, didn't drink much, never talked about family, never mentioned the women from Easey Street. The 1980s came and went, and Perry became invisible, which, as it turns out, is the safest thing you can be when your name once sat in a murder file. Sometime in the early 1990s, he left Melbourne, told people he was heading back to Europe for a while. Family, he said. Maybe business. Maybe both. In truth, it was just another disappearance. Passport stamped. Address gone. He resurfaced years later in Italy. Milan first, then Naples, eventually Rome. Living under the same name, but a different kind of quiet. Rome suited him. Cities with too much history don't ask questions about yours. He found work fixing things, wiring, plumbing, odd jobs. Told neighbours he'd lived in Sydney once, or maybe Brisbane. The story changed depending on who was listening. He spoke Italian well enough to blend in, poorly enough to avoid deep conversation. By the 2000s, he was settled in a modest apartment near the Via Casilina, a fading building with cracked stucco and gossiping widows. To them, he was Il Signor Perry, the polite, solitary pensioner who fed the stray cats and paid rent in cash. He dressed neatly, never smiled long enough to be friendly, and spent evenings on his balcony smoking thin cigarettes like punctuation marks between memories. What nobody in Rome knew, and maybe not even he fully believed anymore, was that the ghosts of Collingwood still had his scent. In 2011, when Detective Ron Iddles reopened the Easey Street case, Perry's name flickered back to life in a database that hadn't existed when he left Australia. When the lab results came in, a faint male DNA profile recovered from one of the victims' clothes. It meant nothing at first. But over the next few years, as the technology improved and family tracing became possible, the match sharpened like a photograph coming into focus. By 2023, the profile pointed toward a specific lineage: Greek-Australian, male, born mid-1950s, once resident of Collingwood. It didn't take long to narrow down the family tree. There it was, the Kouroumblis name, the son who'd left and never come back. Investigators traced his immigration records and located him through Italy's residency database. Same name, same date of birth. Address, Rome. The irony was obscene. A killer who'd escaped halfway across the world, only to be undone by a fragment of DNA smaller than a grain of dust. 47 years of silence erased by a single cell. The Australians contacted Interpol. Paperwork crawled through embassies. Italian authorities were briefed discreetly. They were used to odd requests from abroad, but this one had weight. A murder that predated the internet. A suspect who'd spent more time free than most detectives had spent alive. In September 2024, just after dawn, Italian police knocked on the door of a second-floor apartment in Rome's outer ring. Perry opened it wearing a dressing gown and the vague expression of a man mildly inconvenienced by reality. They told him he was wanted in connection with 2 murders in Australia. He blinked, frowned, and said, "That was a long time ago." He didn't resist, didn't confess either. He simply watched as they searched his flat, the tidy order of an old man's life, a kettle, folded laundry, cat food on the counter. They took a DNA swab. It matched within hours. The odds of it belonging to anyone else were less than 1 in 100 billion. Australia reacted with disbelief. How could the boy next door, the quiet one, the harmless one, be the monster the city had feared for half a century? The press resurrected his teenage photo. Thin face, curling dark hair, eyes that didn't quite look at the camera. In Italy, the more recent mugshot showed the same eyes, only older, tired, and utterly unbothered. He'd lived a full life while his victims turned to headlines. He'd had freedom, sea breezes, espresso, the unearned luxury of ordinary days. Maybe he believed he'd beaten it. That time had buried everything. But time has a wicked sense of humor, and DNA has patience. When they led him out of the building, neighbors leaned over balconies, whispering. To them, he was just the quiet Australian. They couldn't reconcile the frail old man with the words, brutal double murder. They never can. Back in Melbourne, Ron Iddles watched the arrest footage and said nothing. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just closed the file and said, "Took long enough." After 47 years, the boy from Easey Street had grown old, but the ghosts had waited too. Because in the end, time might forgive, but science never does. Rome doesn't blink for much. It's a city that's seen emperors burn, popes scheme, and tourists cry over bad gelato. So when the Italian Carabinieri arrived at a quiet apartment building on the city's eastern fringe, no one thought much of it. They came in unmarked cars at sunrise, moved with the polite efficiency of men who've done this before, and pressed a buzzer that would echo all the way back to Melbourne. Inside, 70-year-old Perikilis, Kouroumblis, opened the door in a bathrobe. He looked like every other Roman pensioner, white hair combed back, slippers, the faint smell of coffee and old tobacco. The officers told him why they were there. He didn't slam the door, didn't shout. He just looked mildly offended, as though they'd interrupted his breakfast. "You're making a mistake," he said in slow Italian. "That was a long time ago." They told him it wasn't long enough. The DNA confirmation had arrived days earlier, pinging between Victoria Police and Interpol like a message from the dead. After nearly half a century, the match was undeniable. The Australian authorities had filed an extradition request, thick with paperwork and understatement. Suspect connected to the 1977 murders of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, Collingwood, Melbourne. The Italian response was equally calm. Subject located. Arrest authorized. It took them exactly 12 minutes to collect him. Inside his apartment, everything was neat. Cups stacked, laundry folded, bed made. No weapons, no trophies, no trace of violence. Just a small, bland life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man accused of one of Victoria's most infamous murders lived like a monk. He didn't even own a television. The police led him down the stairwell past neighbours who'd leaned out of doorways, whispering. "Il signor Peri," one woman said, clutching her shopping bag. "He feeds the cats." Another shook, her head. He never even raised his voice. They watched the frail man being guided into a car, blinking under the Italian sun, and decided the world made no sense. The news reached Melbourne within hours. It was the middle of the night there, but journalists don't sleep for miracles. The morning headlines were biblical. Easey Street, suspect found in Rome, DNA breakthrough after 47 years. The boy next door arrested abroad. In the Victoria Police Building, the reaction was half disbelief, half triumph. Officers who hadn't even been born in 1977 crowded around screens showing grainy footage of the arrest. Reporters flooded Collingwood again, standing in front of the renovated terrace that had once been the crime scene. It now had new paint, solar panels, and a different kind of quiet. But every camera angle looked the same. That narrow facade, the window that had once held a ghost. For the families of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, the news hit differently. Relief, shock, anger, all at once. Some had stopped believing in justice years ago. Others had never stopped waiting. "It's strange," said one relative. "You imagine a monster, and then you see a tired old man." Meanwhile, in Rome, Kouroumblis sat in a holding cell, arms folded, expression unreadable. The Italian guard said he didn't talk much, just asked for water and a cigarette. When shown the extradition documents, he squinted at the English sections and shrugged. "I didn't kill anyone," he said. "They were already dead." He refused to sign anything. His lawyer, a small, nervous man with perfect hair, told reporters his client was shocked and saddened by the accusations, which is legal speak for "we'll deny everything and hope the paperwork gets lost in translation." Back in Australia, the government confirmed it would pursue extradition to ensure the victims' families receive the justice they deserve. The words sounded noble, but behind them was a bureaucratic avalanche. Months of legal wrangling, diplomatic letters, translators, and judges who couldn't quite believe they were dealing with a 47-year-old murder. But the DNA didn't waver. It had no memory to blur, no conscience to twist. Every test confirmed it. The odds were astronomical. 100 billion to 1 that the sample could belong to anyone other than him. The science was relentless. When asked about it later, one forensic analyst said, "You spend your whole career chasing numbers that mean nothing. And then one day you see one that means everything." Back in Melbourne, The case that had haunted a generation was suddenly alive again. Detectives who'd retired decades ago gave interviews. Journalists revisited their old copy, podcasts, documentaries, think pieces. Everyone wanted a slice of the resurrection. And while the city rediscovered its ghosts, in a small Roman cell, Kouroumblis waited. Calm, aging, silent. Maybe he thought the distance still protected him. Maybe he'd stopped caring. Or maybe he finally understood that time had been the world's longest interrogation. And now, at last, he'd been asked the question. From a tiny Melbourne terrace to the marble corridors of Rome, the story had come full circle. The Australian media called him the man who outlived his own crime. The tabloids went harder. Easy Street, killer hides in paradise. But when Perikilis, Kouroumblis appeared in an Italian courtroom that autumn morning, he didn't look like a killer or a fugitive. He looked like a pensioner who'd just been told his bus was late. His lawyer, a slick Roman defense attorney named Bill Doog, had flown in from Melbourne, briefcase in hand, grin like he'd been waiting for this case his whole life. He told reporters that his client was a gentle man wrongfully accused by an algorithm. That phrase alone bought him a week's worth of headlines. The strategy was simple. Attack the science, sow doubt, and drown the public in technical jargon until no one remembered what DNA even stood for. The defense claimed contamination, that the evidence had sat in a police locker for 40 years, handled by dozens of people, degraded, mislabeled, possibly swapped. They called the tests scientific necromancy, accusing investigators of resurrecting dead evidence just to prove they could. DNA doesn't tell stories, Doog said, pacing before the cameras. People do, and the people who handled this case in 1977 were not gods. They were men with typewriters and cigarette ash on their shirts. The press loved it. Old school detective versus modern skeptic. The headlines wrote themselves. Behind the performance, though, there was a real fight brewing. The prosecution's case hinged almost entirely on that single DNA match. A microscopic trace of male genetic material found on one victim's clothing. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no surviving physical evidence strong enough to stand alone. Just that one whisper from 1977. And whispers, the defense argued, could lie. Kouroumblis sat through it all like a statue, his expression carved from stone. Sometimes he looked faintly amused, other times bored. When asked whether he'd ever been inside the house on Easey Street, he simply said, "No, never." When pressed further, he shrugged. It's been 50 years. You remember everything from 50 years ago? There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter in the courtroom. Even the judge smirked. But outside, Melbourne wasn't laughing. The victims' families called the defense a circus. Talkback radio hosts debated the ethics of ancient justice. Could a man be convicted by molecules alone? Should a 70-year-old face trial for something that happened before most jurors were born? Meanwhile, forensic experts defended their work. The lab results were reviewed, audited, retested. The chain of custody, though old, had survived well enough to hold up under scrutiny. The DNA sample wasn't magic. It was chemistry. And chemistry doesn't care how many years have passed. Then came the twist, the alternate suspect. The defense dug up an old police theory from 1977 about a different man. A violent drifter named Alan Carter, who had been questioned briefly and later died in prison. Carter had no DNA on record. He died before such things were standard. But his name appeared in early reports. The defense seized on it like a lifeline. "Why are we resurrecting a pensioner?" Doog thundered, when the real killer might already be dead. He demanded that Carter's remains be exhumed for comparison. The prosecution objected, calling it a desperate sideshow. The judge, perhaps entertained, allowed it. If there's another ghost in the room, he said dryly, let's give him a chance to speak. The exhumation made front-page news. When the results came back weeks later, the scientists confirmed what everyone suspected. Carter wasn't a match. He was guilty of many things, but not Easey Street. Still, the damage was done. Doubt had crept in. That's all a defense lawyer ever really needs. Through it all, Kouroumblis remained detached, answering only when necessary. When a reporter shouted, "Did you do it?" As he was led out of court, he paused just long enough to make it theatrical. "I didn't kill anyone," he said softly. "I just got old." It was either the most chilling thing he could have said, or the most pathetic. In Melbourne, the city that had once lived in fear of an unknown monster was now transfixed by his frailty. The contrast was cinematic. 2 young women full of life, and an old man who'd spent half a century avoiding questions. Justice, it seemed, had a strange sense of timing. Next came the committal hearing. The moment when speculation would finally meet evidence, and 47 years of whispers would face the light. Melbourne, October 29th, 2025. Nearly half a century after 2 women were murdered in a narrow Collingwood terrace, the courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper. Reporters packed every seat. The air buzzed with that uneasy blend of caffeine, expectation, and moral fatigue. Perikilis, Kouroumblis, entered quietly. Slow, careful steps. A neatly pressed suit that didn't quite fit anymore. No shackles, just a guard hovering a respectful distance behind. He looked more like someone's confused grandfather than the alleged killer of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett. But everyone in the room knew the weight of those names. The judge, a silver-haired veteran with a dry wit, began the proceedings briskly. "We are not here for nostalgia," he said. "We are here for evidence." And evidence, finally, there was. The prosecution opened with calm precision. The Crown's representative, Senior Prosecutor Caroline Hensley, wasn't dramatic. She didn't need to be. She laid it out like a math problem. A partial DNA profile, recovered from preserved clothing, cross-checked with modern databases, matched to the accused with a probability 100 billion times more likely than to any other person on Earth. "Science," she said, looking over her glasses at the defense bench, "does not forget." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the judge allowed himself a faint nod. The defense predictably came out swinging. Bill Doog stood up like a man auditioning for a courtroom drama. "What science remembers," he countered, "depends entirely on who's handling the microscope." His voice echoed in the chamber. "This DNA sample, this holy relic of the 70s, has been handled, stored, mislabeled, and rediscovered like a cursed artifact in a bad movie. And we are supposed to believe it survived 50 Melbourne summers intact?" The audience chuckled. Even some jurors smiled. He was good. Too good. But the prosecution had anticipated the theatrics. They called forensic experts one after another, each explaining in deadly calm tones how DNA degradation works and why the sample had remained viable. It wasn't luck. It was science. The fibers were protected, sealed, preserved in conditions no one expected to matter back in 1977. And yet, somehow, they had. Then came the emotional pivot. The 1-2 punch. the baby. The court heard testimony from the surviving child, now in his late 40s, a quiet man with the same eyes as his mother. He spoke briefly, voice steady but trembling at the edges. "I grew up," he said, "knowing I survived something. I just didn't know what. Or who," he paused, glancing toward Kouroumblis. "Now I do." The room went silent. Even the defense didn't interrupt. For a brief second, 47 years collapsed into one unbearable moment. Outside, Melbourne was watching. Screens glowed in cafes, pubs, and office lobbies. Commentators dissected every quote. Some said the case was watertight. Others called it witchcraft with microscopes. Twitter trended with hashtag Easey Street Trial, as though the murders were breaking news again. Inside, Doog went for one last swing. He argued that the case was built on the weakest form of evidence, one molecule standing against time, memory, and reason. He pointed at Perry, sitting motionless. "Look at him. This is your monster. This man who can barely stand without help." Hensley didn't even look up. "Age," she said quietly, "is not an alibi." The judge didn't flinch. "Proceed." Over the next 2 days, the hearing became less about guilt and more about endurance. The legal system was catching up to something ancient, not just a crime, but an entire generation's unfinished sentence. By the final afternoon, the judge summarized the arguments with surgical calm. The DNA evidence was admissible. The chain of custody was intact. The witness testimony, though emotional, was consistent, and the defendant would stand trial for 2 counts of murder. When the decision was read, Perikilis barely blinked. No outburst, no reaction. Just that faint smirk. The same one captured in a decades-old photograph. The one that never quite reached his eyes. The guards led him out as flashes erupted. A journalist shouted, "Perry, do you feel any remorse?" He stopped for half a second. "I feel tired," he said, and then he was gone. Outside, the wind picked up down William Street, carrying with it the noise of cameras, reporters, and the ghosts of a city that had waited far too long for this moment. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar back to life. It limps in, slow and steady, wearing an old man's face. By the time the hearing ended, Melbourne had changed again. Not the skyline, that was still all glass and construction cranes, but the way the city breathed. For a few strange weeks in late 2025, people talked about Easey Street the way they used to talk about football or the weather. It was on everyone's lips, in headlines, whispered over flat whites. Did you see the footage? The DNA guy? The baby? The crime that had once terrified a neighborhood was now a national ghost story being retold in high definition. On Easey Street itself, life went on, as it always had. The terrace where Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett had lived was now worth nearly $2 million. Renovated, polished, stripped of its ghosts, new owners, new paint, solar panels on the roof, but even the real estate listings couldn't quite shake the history. The agents called it a property with a remarkable provenance. That's Melbourne, for we know what happened here, but the kitchen's new. Locals still cross the street when they walk past at night, out of habit rather than fear. Some said you could feel a heaviness there, a silence that hummed under the streetlights. Others claimed it was all myth, trauma that had become folklore. Journalists camped outside for weeks after the hearing, interviewing neighbors, retired cops, even psychics who claimed to feel the energy of the place. One elderly woman who'd lived there since the 70s said, "We used to close our windows back then, every night. After the murders, Nobody left the house without checking the locks twice. She looked down the street, shaking her head. Now, the kids don't even know who those women were. But some remembered. Ron Iddles, now officially retired, again, stood outside the courthouse on the day the decision was announced. He didn't do interviews anymore, but a journalist caught him lighting a cigarette and asked what he thought. He exhaled slowly, eyes on the pavement. "Took 47 years," he said. "But sometimes that's what it costs." He didn't elaborate, because he didn't have to. The city already knew what he meant. For others, the case reopened old wounds. Former detectives who'd botched the original investigation gave cautious statements about limitations of the time. Younger officers said the case proved the system worked, eventually. But the truth sat somewhere in between. Melbourne's history was full of ghosts like this one. Cases left to rot. Victims forgotten until science or guilt resurrected them. Even the younger generation, raised on podcasts and streaming documentaries, found something unsettlingly intimate about Easey Street. 2 teachers, a baby, a quiet house, no robbery, no noise, no closure. It was the kind of horror that didn't need embellishment, just facts, left alone long enough to ferment. In Collingwood, murals had long replaced memory, but now, a local artist painted a new one. 2 abstract faces in muted tones, side by side, half fading into the bricks. Beneath it, a single line. Some doors never truly close. The media moved on eventually, as they always do. New scandals, new trials. But for a city that prides itself on its culture and coffee, the case remained a stain you couldn't quite scrub out. You could paint over the house, change the locks, sell the property, but you couldn't erase the sound of what didn't happen there for 3 days. No footsteps, no laughter, no voice answering the baby's cries. In the end, Melbourne didn't get the cathartic ending it wanted. There was no tearful confession, no dramatic apology. Just a tired old man awaiting trial, and a city forced to remember what it once feared. But remembering maybe was the point. Because history doesn't haunt places. People do. And the people of Melbourne, in their own strange way, had kept this story alive for 47 years. Now, finally, it could rest. Or at least try to. And that sleepless rabble was the story of the Easey Street murders. A quiet house, 2 lives stolen, and a city that refused to forget. Soft pause. It took nearly half a century for one whisper of DNA to speak loud enough to reach the courtroom. But the story isn't finished yet. The man accused still waits for judgment. And when that verdict comes, you know we'll be here. Part 2 is coming. So if you want to know how it ends, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments. Do you believe in justice after 47 years? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Easey Street Murders. Part 1. Good night. And remember, some ghosts take their time.